Thank you so much for coming to the webinar today. My name is Rachel Usher, and I am a project manager with the Georgia Climate Project based here out of Atlanta, and thrilled to be helping to organize this ecosystems webinar today. So for those of you who might not be familiar with us, the Georgia Climate Project is a consortium of academic institutions in the state of Georgia, and we're all sort of researching and working on climate change in different ways, looking to answer the questions, what does a changing climate mean for Georgia, and what can we do about it? Many thanks to our funders who make our work possible. Thank you so much. We also, so this is our home website, really focusing in on those two fundamental questions that we like to ask. What does a changing climate mean for Georgia, and what can we do about it? So we really see this webinar as really directly answering that first question, what does a changing climate mean for Georgia? We've focused the series on a few different themes that really laser focus in on some key climate change impacts in the state of Georgia. So today you're here to hear ecosystems, but we have hosted two other webinars on what does a changing climate mean for Georgians' health and coastal Georgia. So we do invite you to go and look at our YouTube page to check out some of these other webinar recordings right here in the bottom corner. You can click this playlist and see our other two webinars. We do have an upcoming webinar this December 16th that I would like to flag. That's going to be on water resources. This series will continue into the spring. We haven't quite finalized our topic lineup, but please stay tuned and we will be in touch with more information. So moving right along, this webinar series has been launched in conjunction with this part of our website called the Georgia Climate Information Portal. This is a repository of information, it's kind of like the Cliff Notes version of what we're going to be doing here today. So I did want to go ahead and share with you what that looks like. So if you were to go to our website, and scroll on over, you would see this is our Georgia Climate Information Portal with the three themes that we've launched so far. The ecosystems page is live today. So when you click on that, you can read sort of these key messages about what changing climate means for ecosystems, as well as some more overview, in addition to resources, other partners in the Southeast that are working on this. So take as deep of a dive as you're interested in, but we're really proud of this product. And we're very interested to hear your feedback. So if you take a look and you're like, wow, I think they really should be adding or talking about some particular things or resources, please send them to our email, which I'll be sharing a little bit later. So going back into our slide deck, we also have, I did want to flag our Georgia climate stories. This is really answering both of the questions, what does a changing climate mean for Georgia and what do we do about it? We really use this series to showcase Georgians across the state who are actively working on both solutions and thinking about how to mitigate the impacts of climate change. And we have a really sort of interactive portal where you can go and view all of our stories and kind of take this amazing tour around the state of Georgia. So say if we were interested in learning about sea level sensors that have been recently installed in Chatham County, you can sort of zoom on into Chatham County and watch the story. So we're going to be having a few more come online, but this is a really fun tool that we've developed over the past year or so since launching at the Georgia Climate Conference in 2019. And we really do hope it could be useful and interesting to a variety of different stakeholders in the state of Georgia. We did want to go ahead and mention a partnering effort that we are so grateful and excited to support at Drawdown Georgia. This is a research initiative based out of Georgia Tech that helped to identify the 20 most important climate solutions in the state of Georgia. And this was brought together researchers from all across the state, led by Dr. Marilyn Brown. And this is an enormous amount of work. And we're so excited that it was able to launch earlier this year. So we really do encourage you, if you're interested on the solution space, to go check out this website, read the technical briefs, and really learn about how some smart switches in the state of Georgia could really be helping us to draw down megatons of carbon. So really exciting work. And right now we're in the process of, that project is in the process of transitioning to the implementation phase. So if you have expertise or interested in thinking and working on how do we actually implement these solutions at scale, please get in touch with them and learn more. It's a really, really exciting effort underway. Lastly, I did want to flag that Georgia Climate Project is on social media. Please follow us. Promise you won't miss any updates about upcoming webinars or new releases from us. We're on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Thank you so much for all of, we've had a ton of activity on Twitter leading up to this event. And if you want to tweet about anything, please be sure to tag us at Georgia Climate Project or at Georgia Climate Proj right there. You can see us and follow us as well. So before we get started with our amazing panel today, I did want to flag a few technical details on the Zoom webinar platform. I'm sure all of you are Zoom experts by now, but this platform, participants, you're going to have your video and audio off for the remainder or the duration of this webinar, but you will be able to interact with us through this chat and Q&A buttons at the bottom. Chat, feel free to introduce yourself to everyone else on the call. And the Q&A, that's where we're really going to ask you to direct your questions for our panelists. They'll be taking questions after each of their talks and also at the very end in sort of a group fashion. We do want to hear your feedback on what you thought about today's webinar. We do encourage you to fill out an evaluation link that will pop up after the webinar is done, and also that we'll be sending out in an email. So without further ado, I would just like to go ahead and introduce what does a changing climate mean for Georgia's ecosystems. We have a fabulous moderator here with us today that I'm going to go ahead and introduce, who is Dr. Keogh. She joined Emory University's Department of Environmental Sciences as a lecturer in spring 2018. She received her PhD in ecology in 2016 from the Odum School of Ecology, University of Georgia, where she held a lecturer position between 2016 and 2018. Her courses incorporate hands-on project-based learning, including opportunities to explore Georgia's ecosystems whenever possible. Her research is focused on the evolutionary ecology of invasive species with a focus on marine host-parasite interactions. All right, thanks so much. And here is Carrie.
Great, thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you all so much for being here. I'm really thrilled to get to moderate today's panel. Let me just really quickly check. Can you all see, hopefully the...
Yes.
Okay, fantastic, great. So we're just gonna start off with a few slides just to make sure we're all on the same page. I think we already are. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but about why Georgia's ecosystems are so special in the first place. And then just take sort of a 30,000 foot view of what some of the challenges are that are facing some of these special ecosystems. Because today's panel is focused mostly on terrestrial systems, I'll start us off with thinking a little bit about some of these issues in freshwater and coastal systems, and then I'll introduce our amazing lineup of experts who really are, we're so pleased and lucky to have joining us today. So, I think we all know that Georgia comprises a huge diversity of habitat types, and this sort of physical diversity of the state from the ancient Appalachian Mountains in the sort of northern part of our state, giving way to the sort of sandy and much geologically younger coastal plain sets the stage for Georgia to be able to host a huge amount of different kinds of species. So Georgia is one of the most biologically rich states in the nation, with this incredible array of iconic vascular plants, mammals, fish, crayfish, reptiles, and amphibians, some of which occur nowhere else in the world. So in freshwater systems in particular, we have bragging rights for being sort of the third most biodiverse state in the nation in terms of our freshwater fish diversity. And we hold the second place title, if you will, for the diversity of amphibians in the state. So in terms of challenges faced by these diverse assemblages of species, we know that in aquatic systems, warmer temperatures will increase the oxygen demand of aquatic species while simultaneously reducing the amount of oxygen that the water can hold. And this challenge of warming, combined with lower flows during these predicted longer and more severe periods of drought, can dramatically decrease the availability of suitable habitat for species living in these environments. And so this is, of course, particularly a concern for cold water species that live in the northern parts of the state, but it's a shared threat for aquatic organisms throughout the state. And these challenges of warming and changes in water availability can interact with existing stressors in the system. So things that already cause stress include things like runoff of sediments and nutrients from the surrounding landscape, or things like obsolete dams or malfunctioning culverts that can isolate populations in streams and further reduce their access to suitable habitat. Another system that we won't really have time to get into any detail on today, but that I think we all know and love, is Georgia's coast. So Georgia's only got about 100 miles, right, of coast and coastal habitats, but it provides a globally important passageway for migrating and nesting species like these iconic shorebirds and loggerhead sea turtles. And it also hosts about 2/3 of the intact salt marsh on the eastern coast of the US. And salt marsh is one of these incredibly productive types of ecosystems. It probably has a similar carbon storage capacity to tropical rainforests. And all of these coastal systems are experiencing some unique stressors. So in addition to experiencing warming as a stress, we already know that warming, for example, is associated with an increase in black gill disease in shrimp. There are other things affecting coastal systems, such as ocean acidification, which we're particularly concerned about from the perspective of some of our foundational shellfish species like oysters. And then, of course, rising sea levels will squeeze the availability of this habitat and require upland space for these coastal marshes to migrate into. As conditions are changing across the state as a whole, there are some sort of shared challenges, right? So as the distribution of suitable habitat is impacted by things like drought and excess rains, increased severity of storms, and warming temperatures, we expect that species may be able to contract their ranges or expand their ranges or shift their ranges in different ways, potentially to keep pace with this change, but sometimes not. And so protecting high quality habitat and making sure that those high quality habitat patches are connected to each other is a real important focal point for managing risk to some of these iconic and important ecosystems. So given that we have such complex challenges facing our Georgia ecosystems, there are lots of opportunities for synergistic solutions. And we're so lucky in Georgia to have a huge number of brilliant people and really great organizations that are working actively on solving these issues and creating partnerships. For today's panel, we're going to focus on highlighting some of those ongoing research and conservation efforts. And I'll just re-emphasize what Rachel said, which is that we're really hoping that you all, as experts in the audience and also people who maybe aren't experts but who are interested in these issues, will encourage you to engage in whatever way you can. Please talk to each other in the chat. Please submit questions in the Q&A, and please interact with the Georgia Climate Portal, where we've got a place where you could maybe send us some additional information about work you might have ongoing or pose questions about topics that particularly interest you. So as far as today's panel, will be structured into sort of two groups loosely. So first off, we'll have the theme of what climate change means for Georgia's terrestrial ecosystems. And we'll hear from Dr. Jenny McGuire of Georgia Tech, Dr. Stephen Brantley of the Jones Center at Ichauway, and Dr. Jackie Mohan from UGA's Odom School of Ecology. And then we'll sort of shift gears and think about sort of what can we do about mitigating change in these systems. And we'll hear from Dr. John Ambrose, who's the chief of the Wildlife Conservation Section for Georgia DNR, and Corina Newsome, who is the Community Engagement Manager for Georgia Audubon. So with no further ado, I will introduce our first panelist. Dr. Jenny McGuire is an assistant professor in the School of Biological Sciences and Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at the Georgia Institute of Technology, where she leads the Spatial Ecology and Paleontology Lab. Jenny's an NSF Career Awardee and an associate editor for the Journal of Biogeography. Her research focuses on how terrestrial organisms have shifted their distributions in response to changing climates and human land use. And she uses these findings to identify strategies for conserving biodiversity in the face of rapidly changing climates and expanding human footprints. She also works with the Nature Conservancy, the Wildlands Network's Eastern Wildways Project, and other nonprofit organizations to identify strategies for creating landscapes that integrate wildlife connectivity with human land use and needs. All right, thank you so much, Jenny.
So can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So thank you to all of you guys for coming, and thank you very much for inviting me to talk today. I am going to lay the groundwork for how do we anticipate climate change to affect terrestrial ecosystems and terrestrial biodiversity, and really thinking about this issue of dynamism and dynamic responses to changing climates. And so I'd like to start off just by acknowledging my lab, the Spatial Ecology and Paleontology Lab. It's a little bit of an old picture, but these folks are broadly involved in much of the research that I'm going to talk about today. So I like to start off many of my talks with this picture because I think it's really effective video. And it demonstrates how we think vertebrate species, amphibians, mammals, and birds would need to shift their distributions if they were to track changing climates. And we anticipate that changing climates will redistribute terrestrial ecosystems. And it's been demonstrated over and over again that species generally respond individualistically. So different species respond at their own rates and in their own ways. And this speaks to what was said in the introduction, that we need to, in order to facilitate the needs of species, we need to maintain really excellent habitats and really excellent connectivity. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit with respect to species needs and ecosystem needs in the face of changing climates. And so if we zoom in here on Georgia and take a look at the Southeastern United States, what you see is that Georgia and the Southeast is a superhighway, right, for any species, any vertebrate species that are needing to track changing climates. But we also have this challenge of fragmented habitats. So human land use, such as agriculture or urbanization, that has the potential to limit species movement potential. So what you're looking at here on this map is a map of the remaining more natural habitat patches across the contiguous United States. And these are colored by the mean annual temperature of each of those landscape patches. And you can see that the West has a lot more contiguous natural habitats, intact habitats remaining than the Eastern United States. If you were to say, okay, if something were living in one of these habitat patches, what is the extent to which something living there could track climate? Could it track climate sufficiently that it could outrun predicted climate changes? What we end up seeing is that only 41% of land area in the contiguous United States would facilitate the tracking of species ability to track changing climates as they're changing over the next 80 years. And you can also see these blue areas where things would be able to successfully track climate are mostly in the Western United States and much less in the Eastern United States. But one of the strategies that folks are going to talk about a fair bit is the potential for increasing connectivity and potentially creating habitat corridors. So here's some examples of some habitat corridors. This is an overpass on the bottom here over a highway to facilitate movement across roadways. Habitat corridors also often fall along waterways because we have a lot of buffering regions across waterways, but also can facilitate movement and tracking of climate across the landscape. So if we were to look at a map like this of some theoretical placements of habitat corridors that could connect up these different natural landscapes, what you can see is that these corridors would potentially connect up regions that were warmer to regions that were potentially colder. And by creating this type of connectivity, what ends up happening is that we could have an increase in the ability of species to track climate across the contiguous United States. And here, if you look at Georgia, we have many more blue areas, places where things would be able to potentially track climate if we increase our connectivity in this region. And just as a summary slide, this is the red areas are areas that can succeed only through connectivity. And then gray areas are areas where you see climate connectivity never being able to happen, in part because the climate gradients just are too shallow to allow things to potentially track climate here. And so if we zoom in again on the Southeastern United States, we can see that connectivity in Georgia is critical for allowing climate tracking. And this area is critical for wildlife's ability to potentially track climate. I just want to take a moment to give a nuance on this. This is a project that was done by my postdoc, Sylvia Pineda Munoz, and it demonstrates that not all mammals, in fact, tolerate humans to the same extent. So for some species, increasing connectivity is more important than for other species. So what she was able to demonstrate was that many large mammal species, such as bears or pumas or bison, in fact, have shifted the climates in which they live away from human impacted areas such as urban regions or croplands. Whereas many small mammal species have in fact expanded the climates in which they live into areas that have anthropogenic impact. So they now are facilitated and live in more climates than they used to live in because of the fact that they can live in, trash cans and nooks and crannies and agricultural fields. So we see this in things like squirrels and voles in some cases. So connectivity is important for different animals and to different extents. So I just want to talk a little bit more about how dynamically do we think these terrestrial ecosystems are going to need to shift. And this is work that was done by Yue Wang, who's also a postdoc in my lab for the last several years. And I want to introduce this idea of climate resilience. So this is the ability of an ecosystem to persist or recover back to its original state in the face of changing climates. And so for this, we looked at the resistance time, the ability of an ecosystem to persist. So a deciduous forest remains a deciduous forest despite some change in environmental conditions. And recovery time, this is the time that it takes for an ecosystem to resume back to its original state after transitioning. So a deciduous forest that shifts to a grassland and then back to a deciduous forest. And we looked at 310 sites and looked at pollen samples from the last 20,000 years. This is what this would look like. This is a core where we record the pollen samples through time. And what we ended up finding was that North American plant biomes, and these are things like deciduous forests or desert biomes or prairie biomes, they transition approximately every 300 years. And I think this is much faster than many people realize. Of course, forest ecosystems transition last longer, more like 700 years, and grass and shrublands last more like 360 years, so they're faster. And these, I'm just going to point out this figure up here. things transition faster when we have high rates of temperature change. And today, what we're seeing over the last 4,000 years, plant biomes are exhibiting low resilience over the last 4,000 years, and this resilience is continuing to decrease. So what's the punchline here? We should expect dynamic ecosystem shifts in coming years. Ecosystems transition rapidly. Increasingly rapid temperature changes are going to exacerbate those turnover rates. So in the time period that we studied, temperature changes were 10 times slower than they are today. And these residence times, biomes are already unstable following agricultural expansions. And this historical record, in fact, is very useful for understanding ecosystem dynamics. So just really quickly, some solutions. So one of the things that is important for increasing resilience, for increasing the ability of biodiversity to survive in Georgia, is going to be increasing landscape resilience, reducing extinction vulnerability. And what are the characteristics of resilient systems? High connectivity, functional redundancy, and high richness. So really, and complex landscapes. And so with that, I'd like to thank my collaborators, and I can answer a few questions, I think.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. McGuire, for that presentation. And yes, we do have time for one question. If anybody, I'll just put a reminder out there to all the attendees to please feel free to use the, to ask some questions of our panelists while we have their attention. I guess I could start us off, if you don't mind, Jenny, just with one question about, in terms of the amount of data that's required to answer these questions about predicting movement and predicting places where movement is going to be more or less possible and how quickly it's going to take place. What do you see as sort of the challenges in terms of data gaps or ways that we can start filling those in?
Yeah, so one of the main challenges that we see is that fact that I alluded to, with the fact that species over the last, quite recently, have shifted the climates in which they're living. And so in order to really understand the climates in which species can live, we need to really have a more complete picture and use the physiology and a detailed understanding of the locations where species can live and can persist. And another thing that's really important to understand is kind of the fidelity with which different species really align with different climates. So, some species are more flexible. They don't mind, climate's not really what controls where they live, right? And so really understanding the differences between the species that need to shift in response to climate change and maybe those that are more affected by other aspects of their environment.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Okay, we'll look forward to getting back to Dr. McGuire and her expertise in the full panel Q&A. We're going to go ahead and get our next panelist queued up. So Dr. Stephen Brantley is going to focus a little bit more on a particular ecosystem. We'll be focusing on sort of the coastal plain systems and longleaf pine forests that make up some really critical habitat down there. Dr. Brantley is an associate scientist in ecohydrology at the Jones Center at Ichauway. After serving in the U.S. Army, Dr. Brantley received his master's and PhD from the Virginia Commonwealth University. In his previous position at the U.S. Forest Service Coweta Hydrologic Lab in Western North Carolina, his research focused on the effects of forest vegetation change and hemlock woolly adelgid infestation on mountain watershed hydrology. In his current position at the Jones Center, his ecohydrology research now centers on longleaf pine water budgets, as well as the potential benefits of longleaf pine restoration for improving water supplies and protecting aquatic ecosystems in the southeastern US.
Okay, thank you, Carrie. And can you see my screen okay?
Not yet.
Is it not sharing?
We currently cannot see it.
Okay. Let's try that.
Yep, looks good.
Okay, and you see the presentation view.
Yep, that looks perfect.
Okay. Thank you very much, Carrie, for that introduction. I think the first presenter really set up well in terms of talking about resilience and different species needs and the sort of the continental scale at which we need to think about these things. What I'm going to be focused in on today is a little different, and that's one particular ecosystem, and that's longleaf pine. I'm going to talk about some of the potential effects of climate change on longleaf pine, but also its potential role in helping us adapt to climate change. Longleaf pine woodlands were once widespread across the Southeast, over 90 million acres. And as you see on the photo on the left, they were an important source of resources, such as turpentine, which you see that is a small turpentine operation on the left, but also high quality timber. Land use change, including agricultural expansion, over-harvesting, in more recent years, urban land use change have combined with a lack of prescribed fire to really decimate longleaf pine over the last century and a half. And in fact, only about 4% of longleaf's original range or original extent is still intact. But restoration, I think, represents a viable alternative for future forest cover because of some of the specific ecosystem characteristics. And there are things about longleaf pine that help it potentially adapt and help us adapt to warming, to increased hurricanes, to things like water scarcity. And so I'll be highlighting a little bit of my own research, but also sharing some general knowledge about longleaf pine and also representing some key collaborators of the Jones Center. So longleaf pine ecosystems in one slide. Biodiversity. Longleaf is often recognized for its open canopy structure, which is maintained by low intensity prescribed fire or frequent fire. They're again, over 90 million acres that extended from Virginia to Texas, Georgia being right in the epicenter of that. I think only Florida has a little bit more cover than longleaf pine. That number is less than 5 million acres now, with less than 1 million acres in Georgia. Remnant longleaf pine, like we have here at Ichauway, is probably best known for its exceptionally high biodiversity, especially for its herbaceous ground cover. On the 30,000 acres here at Ichauway, we have over 1,200 vascular plant species. We also have endemic species like red cockaded woodpeckers, quail, which aren't necessarily endangered, but are an important cultural species, and gopher tortoises. And these species have really served to date as sort of the main impetus for conservation of longleaf pine. More recently, we've learned about longleaf pine and its role as a potentially good source of long-term carbon storage. So it's not a fast-growing species. The forests are not particularly dense, but when they're stable and there's less loss from, say, severe fire or from short rotation harvesting, what we see is a buildup of carbon in soils. And so there's a sort of marathon approach to carbon sequestration if you're talking about longleaf pine. And then also one of the main focuses that I tend to research is its naturally low water use because of its structure and its responses to climate. So what are the effects of climate change that we're anticipating or really observing at this point on southern forest and longleaf pine in particular? I can't go into an exhaustive list in this time period, but aside from obvious increases in temperature and sea level rise in coastal Georgia, the two main things that we tend to focus on are droughts and increasing drought severity and frequency, and also on tropical storms and their effect. If you look at the upper right-hand corner, that's the Palmer Drought Severity Index for the last 40 years or so. And you can see just in the last 20 years, we've had 3 long-term, fairly severe multi-year droughts. In the early 2000s is that broad yellow. And then again around 2007, and then 2011 to 2013. And those certainly have an impact on forests, both directly in tree mortality and also indirectly in bringing in things like insects or making forests more susceptible to insects. And those types of droughts appear to be increasing. What exacerbates that, of course, is the higher summer temperatures and longer growing seasons that are likely to increase demand for water in the soil, and those can have effects both on individual species but also on communities. Increases in storm frequency are another issue. What I did here in the lower left was plot all the storms over the last 170 years that have crossed through Georgia. And you can see that we're basically right there in the epicenter, maybe a little less than Florida, but we get a lot of storms. We average about 1 tropical storm tracking over the state of Georgia per year. And so those storms can cause catastrophic wind damage. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on with Hurricane Michael. So the loss of longleaf pine that we've experienced in the region over the last century and a half is particularly unfortunate because longleaf tends to be, we think, a little bit better adapted to both drought and tropical storms. Just a quick example, longleaf pine has been touted as both drought resistant and tolerant of wind from hurricanes, although there's some scant scientific evidence to back that up until fairly recently. But part of that resilience probably stems from the deep taproot. And there's no pun intended. It's rooted in the taproot rather than stems from it. But that taproot is specific to longleaf pine among the southern pines and other oak species. This root structure provides both access to water in times of scarcity, and it also provides a solid anchor against wind throw. Of course, a more deeply rooted tree is going to be more difficult to push over. Deeply rooted trees, depending on the soil type, may also be shorter, which actually makes them less susceptible to wind exposure. But I want to talk a little bit about the hydraulic lift and this idea of facilitation that longleaf pine can facilitate ground cover species through the process of hydraulic lift or hydraulic redistribution. And basically longleaf pine through this taproot can bring up groundwater during the nighttime, and if it doesn't use it during the day, it will redistribute it into the soil. And so a recent study that we did here at the Jones Center showed that a significant amount of groundwater is brought up through this taproot during the night, and that water is released into the surrounding soil if it's not used up by the tree. This only happens when soil surfaces are really dry, so during droughty times. And what we showed was that water subsidy actually would reduce water stress in ground cover species. So it's really not just about the trees and their wind firmness, but actually about the ecosystem working as a whole to help sustain itself. Another project that we're looking at that's a little bit broader, of course, we're interested in resistance and resilience to climate change, which Jenny outlined earlier. We're also looking through this project called Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change at transition sites, meaning what do we need to do to transition the forest to a more climate resilient state. And so what we're doing is we're doing some thinning. We're looking at species composition. In other words, we're selecting species to harvest like mesic oaks or loblolly pine or slash pine that are less drought resilient. And we're measuring the response of the forest in terms of tree mortality or insect infestations, of course, productivity, and also species composition. And then one last thing that I'll mention we're doing actually is a little bit of cross-site facilitated migration where we've moved turkey oaks seedlings into sites that have more mesic soils. So we have a very strong soil gradient here at Ichauway, and well, we seem to have been fairly successful in moving these what we call xeric oaks, like turkey oak, into more mesic sites, and hopefully that kind of management might help the forest to adapt a little better to future conditions. Other experiments that we're doing to address climate change were a lot less planned. One of those being Hurricane Michael, Category 5 storm that passed over us just over 2 years ago. The eye of Hurricane Michael, it was still a Category 2 storm when it passed within 5 miles of Ichauway. Luckily, from a research perspective, we were well positioned to measure the storm's impacts. Our conservation staff has a long-term forest monitoring program with over 800 plots, as you see the little red dots on the map of Ichauway on the bottom left. And we also have a collaboration since 2007 with University of Alabama, Greg Starr and Christy Stouthammer, measuring forest carbon and water across the site with the eddy covariance towers. And so what did we find out of that? Well, thanks to the monitoring program, this recent paper just came out about the impacts of wind on different species, and it looks like in general Pinus palustris is more resilient or wind firm than most of the other species. If you look at the top right figure, this is a probability of tree fall for various tree sizes across different soil types. And you can see that the risk of damage in longleaf pine, which is circled, is generally lower. It's certainly not immune to wind damage, but it is significantly more tolerant of high winds, in our case from a Category 2 hurricane. The second study is being led by a student that I'm sharing with Greg and Christy at Alabama. And if you look at the bottom right panel, you can see the red arrow points to where the storm happened. And then the data, the y-axis shows the maximum assimilation rates, or thinking of this as total forest carbon intake at the stand level. And you can see that there was definitely a decline after the storm, about 35% decline. But within a year, the system maintained or rebounded to about 90% capacity. And so that's a promising result in terms of longleaf pine's long-term sustainability. And just real quickly, I wanted to highlight an ongoing study where one of our UGA alumni and current center scientist Jeff Cannon is actually testing mechanisms of wind firmness in longleaf and in slash pine, and modeling canopy structure to estimate how these species differ in terms of sail area, or the amount of area susceptible to wind. And these kinds of studies, we don't have firm results there yet, but these kinds of studies will hopefully give us insight into better forest management practices. And lastly, I just wanted to briefly mention that the climate benefits of longleaf pine do extend beyond terrestrial systems into wetlands and streams and rivers. And so much of my work starts with studying soil processes. Here's a recently formed sinkhole, or tree water use. But some work we've done with TNC and USDA and are still doing, we're measuring how those processes actually impact adjacent aquatic ecosystems. We just got one paper published about forest restoration in embedded wetlands and protecting those wetlands by increasing hydro period. And we're also working on finishing another paper looking at longleaf restoration at a watershed scale. And so with that, I think I'm out of time or past time, so I'll end there and maybe have time for a question.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephen. So we do have one question, if you don't mind, really quick. So the question is, what role do you think that silvopasture could play in Georgia to increase forest cover? And have you studied its applicability to Georgia longleaf pine ecosystems?
Silvopasture is not something I've thought about a lot, but I know that there are folks that are doing grazing studies, or at least interested in grazing in the region. You know, I think it has potential. I think the ecosystem and the structure of it, of longleaf pine with the ground cover, certainly lends itself to that type of sort of working ecosystem. But I'm not going to pretend to know a whole lot about silvopasture.
Okay, great. And thank you so much, Dr. Brantley. It's really fantastic hearing about the tools that these sort of native species that have evolved in these ecosystems might have for helping promote the resilience of the ecosystem as a whole. We're gonna go ahead and have to shift to our next panelist. So in this sort of first realm of first questions about what climate change means for Georgia ecosystems. So I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Jackie Mohan, who is an associate professor of terrestrial ecosystem ecology and biogeochemistry at the Odum School of Ecology at the University of Georgia. Her lab investigates the role of global change on trees and other plants, mycorrhizal fungi, insect herbivores, soil biogeochemistry, and particularly terrestrial ecosystems. In addition to being one of our esteemed panelists today, Dr. Mohan is also an author in the Georgia Drawdown Project, which I hope everybody will take a moment to look at if you haven't already, that's thinking about, in this particular case, land use and the ways that it can contribute to mitigating or storing carbon. So Dr. Mohan, I'll hand the mic to you.
Thank you, Carrie. Can you see my slides and can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for the introduction, and thank you, everyone, for attending today's. I've just been scribbling notes from our previous speakers, and I'm gonna beg slides from all of you. Today, I'd like to talk to you about global climate change with an eye on Georgia and the Southeastern United States, the importance of the South-Southern distinction, I call it, and what we can do for the future. I'll conclude this as a segue to our final two speakers. I'm having a little trouble. Excuse me. Okay, here we go. So today, when we think about ecosystems and climate, I think it's fairly intuitive to most of us that changing global climate conditions impact ecosystems. But what my lab and I primarily study is how do our changed ecosystems, our changed ecosystem processes, feedback and impact the whole globe's climate system. It's not just the one impacting the other. So for today's presentation, I'll start off with talking about the distinctiveness of Georgia and other southern places, other southern ecosystems. I'll then talk about a few of the sort of general findings regarding how forest ecosystems respond to climate change, with the caveat that the vast majority of these studies were done under northern latitude conditions, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And I'll conclude with how can we in Georgia store more carbon, feeding back to or stemming from, here I will say stem, and rooted in the Georgia Drawdown solutions. So I think many of us are familiar that most of the warming impacts we've been seeing over the last 50 years, what we're seeing now, what we're expected for the future, is a strong bias towards the North Pole, the northern Arctic ecosystems. And while that is true, our southern ecosystems are not only observing warming, but have a couple of challenges that the northern latitudes do not face. Number one, this is an older paper now, looking by paleoecologists and projecting what we might expect planet-wide under end-of-century climate conditions. Now, each pixel depicted in blues here, dark blues, pale blues, mean there's not so much that there's not a change in climate, it's a big change in climate, but the climate predicted for that pixel at the end of this century is already represented somewhere on our planet. We right now have a climate condition similar to, or this very similar to what we forecast those pixels to be like at the end of the century. On the other hand, and here we're bringing in the tropics, we're bringing in the coastal plain of the Southeast, Pixels depicted in warmer colors are going to model to have end of century climates unlike anywhere right now on our planet within a reasonable dispersal scenario. On the left, this is the most dire climate conditions fed by high carbon emissions by humans. This is the path we're on right now, but this is the path we could get to with Georgia drawdown and other solutions. So blue is better on this map. Red is not so good. And you notice that there's a whole swath of the tropics and the subtropics and under both climate conditions that are some of the places depicted in the warmest colors. Now, in addition to differences in climate, we have a strong latitudinal difference in soil types and inherent soil fertility. And I'd like to point out here the Piedmont of the Southeast, this bright yellow color. This is altisol soils. This is a Southeastern soil type. We see it in the tropical and subtropical locations around the planet. These are inherently low carbon, low nutrient soil types, and that will become important. I'd also like to echo the importance of the Southeastern coastal plain. We are the most recently designated global biodiversity hotspot on the planet, representing large numbers of endemic species and also a large amounts of habitat loss that has already occurred. So ecosystems are important. Ecosystems are super important for just about anything you can think of, from carbon sequestration to filtering pollutants out of air and water to providing habitat for all the wonderful species like the trees, like birds, etc., that depend on intact ecosystems. Now, I'd like to point out that much of my talk here today is going to focus on carbon dynamics of the planet. Earth has 3 natural sinks or storage units for emitted carbon. The carbon can go to the atmosphere, which is, of course, largely behind the current climate warming that we're experiencing. The carbon emitted by humans can go to the oceans, causing ocean acidification. But there's a third sink, the land ecosystems. This is, in my opinion, the safest, smartest place to store our carbon, not causing further climate change, not causing ocean acidification, but storing it safely in our land ecosystems, the plants, and especially in the soils. This is kind of a rough draft of a book that just came out just a few months ago. And what I really want to point out to you here is humans are emitting carbon to the atmosphere. Carbon is going from the atmosphere to the oceans at an increased rate than it's coming out. That's ocean acidification. But carbon is also going into our land-based ecosystems. And what I really want to point out is that there's more carbon in our land ecosystem soils than in all the plants and the atmosphere combined. Soils can be some of our best friends when it comes to saving our planet against climate change. So there is a mix of good and bad news in terms of species, biodiversity, faring under warming conditions. This paper comes from the New England and Northeastern United States. And what we see is that largely this is based on habitat modeling, habitat suitability. So it's projecting both future climate conditions and taking into account existing soil and even fragmentation. So we see here for the Northeastern United States, Maine up at the top, Pennsylvania here at the bottom. Under current climate conditions and under projected future climate conditions, the Hadley high and the GCM3 average high, what we see is a general modification, a homogenization of the New England, Northeastern United States forest habitat types. The blue, this boreal spruce and fir, some of the only boreal forest we have in the United States, continental United States, that largely goes away, but it goes to Canada. The species don't go extinct. But what we see is much more prevalence of currently mid-Atlantic and southeastern oak hickory species. But we see largely that the New England area will actually gain in number of species that can grow there at the end of the century because there's species migrating in from the south and from the mid-Atlantic. South of the southeastern coastal plain, of course, are oceans. And so it's a little less clear where exactly species will come to migrate into Florida, into Georgia. What we see up north, a homogenization of habitat. What we will see in the south is a little less clear. And here we are with our northern bias in ecosystem field experiments. Here we're looking at soil warming, soil carbon losses in response to soil warming at many of the planet's sites where we actually are warming up soils. On this map, the Whitehall Forest site in Athens, Georgia, which I'll talk to you about, is the southernmost and longest running lower latitude system. And this is reflected in other ecosystem scale field experiments and global change, a strong northern bias. But there's fundamental differences between the north and the south. Climate and climate change, of course, soil fertility, we talked a little bit about, and biodiversity. So what might we expect for our southern ecosystems? I'm now going to talk to you about some of the work I do with the Drawdown Georgia project. We have 3 major land sinks in the state of Georgia: temperate forests, afforestation, and silvopasture. I'll be happy to address any questions on this. A little bit coastal wetlands as well, limited in size, but so important on a meter per meter square basis. Land use in Georgia. This is fairly consistent over the last several decades, that Georgia is about 60% forested, 20% agricultural land, 60% forested. We got a lot of forest in the state of Georgia. And of the forests, different types of forests here on the left, different carbon pools on the right, this important role of Georgia, about half of the carbon stored in Georgia's forest lands are in the soil environment. This is some photos from the Whitehall soil warming experiment. This began 10 years ago, this last month. It's a highly complicated computerized electronic system where we warm the soils in forested plots. We study how the trees respond and how the soils respond. Today, I'll talk about the soils. The top figure here, the top panel, comes from work I did up at Harvard Forest, where we find tremendous big responses, lots of warming responses on the soils, increasing the flux of carbon from the soils to the atmosphere. The bottom line is we do not see that in the lower latitude soils of the Piedmont in Georgia. We don't see changes in soil carbon functioning, and that could be good news in the climate change standpoint. We're not feeding more carbon to our atmospheres as our soils warm. This is work from Georgia Drawdown. Right here, we're looking at negative CO2 emissions. So this is CO2 storage. Forests in Georgia, super important for carbon storage, and they will increase in importance as they grow over time under the baseline conditions. With management efforts, we could sequester even more atmospheric carbon into our soils and trees of our forests if we plant more trees. And this is not just in intact current forests. This includes planting trees in your backyard, your front yard, planting trees in current pasture lands. Of the drawdown solutions, I'll just point out quickly, we have about 20 solutions. Reducing food waste has the biggest bang for the buck, net costs here, positive costs here. Our land use sinks here in the middle, very cheap and sequestering a good amount of carbon. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. And I'll just do a quick call out to Georgia coastal wetlands and their importance, both for sequestering carbon, but particularly for protecting human coastal societies and infrastructure. So in summary, Georgia and the Southeast are special in a global context. Our ecosystems strongly influence carbon and are critical for storing atmospheric carbon. And Drawdown Georgia, forest carbon storage, plant more trees. That's a nice, happy solution. And now I will say thank you. I think I'm over time. I'll ask if we have time for any questions, but I understand if we do not. Thank you.
Just so much good information, Dr. Mohan. Thank you so much. We're going to move to the next panelist, but I hope that people will continue posting great questions in the Q&A, and our panelists can answer those questions as we go, and we'll hopefully have a couple minutes at the very end for whole panel questions. So Dr. John Ambrose is the first of our two final speakers who are focusing more on sort of this, what can we do about it, or what are we doing about it question. Dr. Ambrose is the Chief of the Wildlife Conservation Section of the Georgia Department of Natural Resources. His primary duties include statewide coordination of research and resource management projects, budget and personnel management, and implementation of the State Wildlife Action Plan. He also oversees environmental education and research, conservation planning, land protection, and development of funding sources for non-game wildlife conservation. And today his presentation will focus on these conservation planning efforts at the state level.
Thank you, Carrie. Just waiting for my PowerPoint to actually wake up here. Okay, thank you. So I hope you can see my screen and you can hear me okay. I want to give a brief overview of some ways that groups are working together on landscape conservation as a means of addressing climate change. Now, our State Wildlife Action Plan has kind of a dual focus, species and habitats. And this serves as the strategic plan for the work that we do and our partners do to conserve priority species and habitats around the state of Georgia. So a lot of work is being done. A lot of different groups are working with Georgia DNR on these projects, but we also need to look more broadly at the condition of the Georgia landscape. What are the key landscape features that need to be protected and connected to ensure functioning ecosystems and healthy populations of native plants and animals? So back in 2015, we developed what we called a map of Georgia Greenway opportunities or priority conservation corridors. And we're currently refining this map. And you can see some of the areas that you may be familiar with. The orange or yellowish colors there are existing Georgia conservation lands. And you have different types of corridors that connect those. Some of these are easily recognized. The Altamaha River Corridor, Georgia's largest alluvial river system, and associated uplands. And as most of you know, this has been an area where a lot of resources have been focused over time to conserve the river system, the adjacent uplands, and create a greater connectivity from the mouth of the river, well upstream. Lots of partners in this effort.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just realized looking at this visualization that we're seeing the notes view. If it's easy to keep going in this format, that's fine. But if you want to switch to presenter view, then we can,
let's see.
Especially with these fantastic maps.
If you check that checkbox in the top middle that says use presenter view, it should turn off that view that we were seeing.
Oh, this one?
It's over to the right. There's a checkbox that says use presenter view, kind of in the middle top of the screen.
Yeah, under monitors, I think.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
Yeah, if you uncheck that and start it, it should hopefully give us a regular view.
Okay. Let me go back a little bit.
Perfect. Thank you.
I wasn't seeing the notes, so I'm not even sure what they were saying. But in any case, we are, I hope you can follow these. So over time, with a lot of help from partners, we have filled in these, and you can see some of the partners there, Georgia DOT, the Department of Defense, Nature Conservancy, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And to date, we have over 200,000 acres protected in this area. If you look again at this map and look at the southeastern corner of the state, you see this corridor that goes from the Okefenokee to the lower Satilla up to the Altamaha River, from there to Fort Stewart, and then from there to the lower Savannah River corridor. More recently, we focused some attention in this area with land conservation, including a couple of tracts that together total more than 24,000 acres. And you can see some of the other parts of this corridor here, the ancient barrier island sequence that connects the Okefenokee from Trail Ridge up to the Altamaha River, and then from there to Fort Stewart. I would note that the map that I referred to is not a blueprint for land acquisition. It's a guide for land conservation in the broader sense. So this could be a combination of fee simple acquisition, conservation easements, voluntary management agreements. But the bottom line is to try to maintain habitat connectivity to accommodate migration of species and natural communities and enhance ecosystem functions. But that's just really the first step, because we know we need to manage these habitats actively to make sure that they're diverse, that they're resilient in the face of climate change. So these habitat management programs need to be based on sound science, and they need to be adaptable to changing conditions over time. At a regional scale, we're part of a network of organizations focused on landscape conservation in the Southeast. The Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy, or SECAS, which was established in 2011, is a conservation initiative that spans the Southeastern US mainland and the Caribbean. So 15 states and 2 US territories. One of the products of SECAS is the Southeast Conservation Blueprint, which is a dynamic map of critical conservation areas in the region and landscape features that are the focus of conservation planning. The goal of SECAS is a 10% or greater improvement in the health, function, and connectivity of Southeastern ecosystems by 2060. So it's a pretty ambitious goal. To track our progress, we developed a scorecard that's based on a variety of different ecosystem indicators. So you can see some of those here for systems ranging from pine and prairie ecosystems, upland forest, forested wetland, more general landscape indicators, freshwater, aquatic, beach and dune, and estuarine and marine systems. So in this summary table, those items that are highlighted in green, we are seeing progress and we're on track currently to meet our goal of a 10% improvement by 2060. In the items in yellow, we're seeing some improvement, but we're not on track currently to meet our goal. And then those items in red, we're actually seeing a decline. So we're moving in the wrong direction. If you notice, pine and prairie birds are seeing currently a 2.7% decline per year. And that's due to a loss of prairie and pine savanna habitat. So this is a trend that affects many other species as well. There are regional conservation programs to address this trend, including the Southeastern Grasslands Initiative. And you can see in the inset map, the area of focus for this particular regional conservation initiative. It's focusing on those areas highlighted in green that were formerly dominated by open pine land or grassland systems. Within the Southeastern Grassland Initiative, we have the Piedmont Prairie Partnership, and that focuses on the most highly populated physiographic region of the Southeast. As you know, historically, much of the Piedmont was grassland or open savanna, maintained by frequent fire and by grazing by bison and elk. Today, it's largely urbanized, converted to agriculture, or we have forests that have grown up in dense stands. But there are opportunities to use areas that are already cleared, including transmission line corridors. So the inset map that you see there is a map of the major transmission corridors within this region, this Piedmont region. And if you add up the area within that corridor network, that transmission corridor network that is feasibly converted to native prairie vegetation, it's over 240,000 acres. So there are a lot of groups that are working within this portion of the landscape right now. One such project is at the State Botanical Garden of Georgia, and that's been in progress for over 10 years now. It incorporates habitat restoration, population augmentation, research, and education. They're using an existing Georgia Power transmission line corridor, and the staff and volunteers have created a diverse prairie habitat that's accessible to visitors and it's accessible to researchers as well. And you can see how this power line cuts across the garden property and crosses the Middle Oconee River here. So they began this work by collecting seed from the prairie and growing plants that were then placed back into experimental restoration plots, basically converting a ground cover of non-native lawn grasses to native ground cover. And the goal over time is to convert about 10 acres of the power line right away into a very species-rich prairie composed of native grasses and wildflowers. And in the process, they're documenting the steps involved in this restoration effort and looking at the impacts of all this work, which will be very important for informing future efforts. Another example of a small-scale effort that has landscape implications is the Georgia Pollinator Partnership, and that's coordinated by the Atlanta Botanical Garden. This initiative encourages the establishment and maintenance of pollinator gardens throughout the state. We worked with ABG earlier this year to update their mapping tool to allow enhanced reporting and photos of the garden so that people, when they register their pollinator garden through this Pollinator Partnership website, they can show what they have, where the garden is located, how large it is. This one from the Kinchafuni Primary School includes a note that it's certified under the Monarchs Across Georgia program. So we've got more than 120 gardens currently registered, and it's becoming more and more popular. It's a great way to encourage the development of these pollinator gardens of various sizes that provide important habitat for migratory birds, bats, insects, and also provide a home for native wildflowers. So the bottom line here is that local initiatives can make a big difference at a landscape scale. It doesn't have to be large-scale land acquisition. That's very important. But these other efforts that are occurring at a local scale, at a population level, and that can be management of utility and transportation corridors, rare plant safeguarding, pollinator gardens, assisted migration, translocation of priority species from one area to another, and population augmentation. All of these things are very important tools to help maintain healthy ecosystems in Georgia and the Southeast. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ambrose. And that is a perfect segue to thinking about these state level conservation initiatives to our final speaker, who will be thinking about this from the perspective of NGOs and also community initiatives. So our last speaker of the panel is Corina Newsome. Corina began in the field of wildlife conservation as a zookeeper, and she currently works in avian conservation. Her graduate research at the Georgia Southern University is focused on nest predators of the seaside sparrow. She currently holds the position of community engagement manager at Georgia Audubon, where her work focuses on connecting people with birds across Georgia. And Corina's mission is to eliminate the systemic barriers that have prevented Black, Indigenous, and people of color from working in wildlife conservation and exploring the outdoors. So we're excited to have Corina contributing to this question of what can we do about it, how we can all engage in this process of protecting Georgia's unique ecosystems and species.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Carrie. It's a pleasure and honor to be here among so many movers and shakers in the conservation world. So as she said, I'm going to be talking essentially about the community perspective when it comes to engaging people around conservation initiatives and kind of utilizing the great resource we have in the people of Georgia to bring these to pass. So when it comes to mobilizing communities, Georgia Audubon, along with lots of other conservation organizations around the state, have kind of understood that mobilizing communities is critical for both the science of conservation as well as implementing the solutions in conservation. So when we think about the landscape which birds and other wildlife are navigating in urban environments, there are a slew of threats that they are facing, including climate change, including human-made structures, and oftentimes physical structures like buildings will create a problem for birds, particularly as it relates to glass and window strikes. And so a couple of the community science initiatives that I'm going to focus on, I'll start with addressing some of the issues that arise from the built environment. So we've been able to mobilize communities in Atlanta and around Georgia for collecting critical data for conservation. And in this particular instance, addressing the issue of window strikes for birds, which kills approximately 1 billion birds a year in the United States alone. We participate in a program called Project Safe Flight. And so we have a group of volunteers, again, in Atlanta and around Georgia, who are assigned a specific route. And this program is led by Adam Betchwell, who is pictured here, who's our conservation director. He assigns a particular route in a city, and volunteers will walk that route on a regular basis, find the birds who have passed away from window strikes, and then we will collect that data and share that data with New York City Audubon and other organizations that will use it for understanding how buildings and urban environments are impacting bird species. Another really important way in which we are mobilizing our local communities around threats facing bird is particularly as it relates to climate change. And of course, that's what we're focusing on in this webinar. And climate change poses varying levels of threat for species across the state of Georgia. And National Audubon has a really awesome resource called Survival by Degrees, which outlines how state by state climate change is expected to impact species of birds within those states. And so this is kind of what it looks like for the state of Georgia. And in order to address the varying impacts of climate change on birds, there is a program called Climate Watch, which Georgia Audubon participates in. And this program essentially serves to help monitor how climate change is specifically impacting the range shifts of native species, because range shifts and kind of a decoupling of, for example, the temperature needs and the habitat needs of birds is one of the major threats in the face of climate change. And so Climate Watch relies pretty exclusively on communities, on community science to collect data about where birds are located. And unfortunately, about 2/3 of the birds on this continent are vulnerable to extinction directly from impacts of climate change. And range shifts are expected to happen, and they have been happening. And so in order to kind of ground truth, so to speak, the models and projections that we have about bird shifts when it comes to climate change, we have people who are assigned a particular spot on the planet in Georgia. This is, of course, a nationwide effort, but they will survey specific bird species once in winter and once in summer over long periods of time to collect this data, which is very valuable for making our predictions and models as accurate as possible, as well as for creating conservation priorities. So you don't have to be a career biologist to participate, you just have to be someone interested. And we are collecting very important data for this issue. Now, in addition to using community members and mobilizing the people, the general public who live in Georgia to collect data about conservation issues, we are also using and employing those same people, those same communities in implementing the solutions to some of the challenges that birds and other wildlife are facing across the state. So some of the solutions that Georgia Audubon in particular has crafted and is expanding across the state of Georgia is kind of making Georgia more habitable for wildlife. So one of the artifacts, of course, of urbanization and urban sprawl and the built environment is that we are eliminating habitat that is available for birds and other wildlife. And so through our habitat restoration program, we are using the communities that exist across Georgia to help remove non-native invasive plants and plant native plants that are specifically geared towards attracting insects that birds and other animals like across Georgia in order to capitalize and maximize the productivity of the green spaces that we have, whether we're talking about in large green landscapes or we're talking about areas that are in the middle of a city that may not be kind of thought about as traditional conservation spaces. Along the same lines, of making Georgia more habitable for wildlife, we are able to kind of empower and give the general public, members of our local communities, the tools to make the spaces in which they occupy, whether it's their homes or lands that they own, or we're talking even about public spaces, making those spaces as habitable as possible for wildlife. And the primary program through which we do that is our Wildlife Sanctuary Program, which is led by Gabe Anderle, who is our Conservation Programs Coordinator for Georgia Audubon. And this program essentially goes around and it's open to anyone in the state of Georgia who is interested in saying, hey, I want the space that I have, whether we're talking about a tiny front yard or a large plot of land, to be as habitable for wildlife as possible. And so we will have volunteers as well as staff with Georgia Audubon go out and survey and assess these locations and make recommendations for making those small patches of green space or large patches of green space as habitable as possible. And when they meet certain standards, we will certify them as a wildlife sanctuary. And that gives people the tools they need to be able to maximize the space where they live and educate them about what it is that native species need to be able to be resilient and to survive in a changing environment. Now, when it comes to crafting solutions for conservation problems and collecting data to help us understand what the conservation problems even are, it's important that at the bedrock, we are understanding that community access is not equal. Community access to wildlife viewing, community access to participation in conservation and community science is not equal. And that is the case because of systemic exclusion, particularly of people from low-income backgrounds and people who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color, as well as people who with different abilities, people who are not able-bodied. So there are several levels of exclusion that happen that are pretty specific to this realm of science that we want to make sure we address in everything that we do. And so Georgia Audubon, I'm very proud to say, has several programs that strategically get at this unequal access when it comes to the communities found across Georgia and who exactly of our community is actually participating in community science, in implementing solutions, and in wildlife viewing and exploration. So the work that we do has to actively counter systemic inequities. We can't just say, we're we're not racist, or we don't want to be exclusive. We have to actively work against the systems that already exist that are excluding members of our community. And so to do that, having community partnerships is critical. And so I'm going to walk through a couple of community partnerships that Georgia Audubon has that makes this possible. So firstly, we will partner with Title I schools across Georgia through a program called Connecting Students to STEM Through Birds. And this program is a partnership between the schools and local landscapers, where we will have gardens with native plants planted at the school, and the students and teachers and the landscapers all participate in planting this garden. And it's essentially self-sustaining because they're native plants. And then we equip the teachers with the curriculums they need to engage their students around wildlife viewing, environmental stewardship, and exploring the outdoors, specifically using those gardens that are now attracting native wildlife to their own classrooms at school. Another several key partnerships that we also have for addressing inequities in access to, whether we're talking about careers in wildlife science and conservation or just participating as a community member, is partnering with local conservation organizations. And one of the ways that we do this is through a program called Atlanta Urban Ecologists, which was founded, of course, when we were formerly Atlanta Audubon. We recently switched to Georgia Audubon this summer. So we are expanding all these programs as we speak. But these partnerships that we form with local conservation organizations allow us to provide career exposure to teens ages 8th, or I guess in grades 8 through 12, with lots of scholarships available for people who for whom costs might be a burden for participating in these kinds of programs. But the partnerships that we have include organizations like Zoo Atlanta, Amphibian Foundation, Trees Atlanta, and other conservation organizations. And these students, over the course of a school year, will get to meet with various professionals in the field and have hands-on experiential learning opportunities. Now, thinking about community access when it comes to physical accessibility, as I had briefly mentioned previously, to participation in careers in science or in community science or outdoor exploration, addressing the issue of limited physical accessibility is very important because a lot of times people are not even thinking about the ways in which people with disabilities are excluded from these activities. And so we have worked with and kind of joined forces with, along with lots of other Audubon chapters across the country, National Audubon, in an effort called Birdability, which was founded by Virginia Rose, who is pictured here on the right-hand side of the screen. And this is a program that essentially, firstly, increases awareness about accessibility issues when it comes to wildlife viewing and community science and participation in these kinds of efforts. But it also actually tangibly creates tools with which people who experience physical disabilities are able to see where accessible trails are. So Birdability has a mapping resource where anyone, regardless of what your ability might be, when you go on a trail, you can fill out a survey about the accessibility of that trail, and that survey that you submit is geo-marked. So the survey that you submit is marked on a map where that trail is. And then if someone is looking to see, okay, where are the physically accessible places that I can go explore in Georgia or in any state across the country, they can look at this map and zero in on the places that are accessible for them. And so this tool is incredibly important for making the outdoors, whether we're talking again about science or simply recreational experiences, accessible, and everyone can participate in making it a success. These surveys are crowdsourced, so anyone, again, regardless of your ability, can contribute to making sure that we are making this space as equitable and accessible as possible. And so I'll just end with the fact that community engagement, I believe and have seen play out in as many contexts as I have existed in, is the bedrock of resilience. And when we're talking about climate change and other changes to our ecosystems and the living spaces of wildlife and people, it's important that we are engaging all cross sections, all communities represented in the places where we live in order to both come out with the best successes when it comes to conservation and the most equitable successes when it comes to the communities that are represented here. So if you are interested in any of the programs that I talked about, there are going to be links to resources on how to get involved with Georgia Audubon's efforts in any of the capacities that I just talked about through the Georgia Climate Project website. So feel free to take a look and sign up to be a volunteer or involved in any of the programs. And if you do have questions, you can certainly feel free to reach out and I'll be happy to answer them.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Corina. So we are at 12:29. I want to just take a second to give a huge thank you to all of our panelists for sharing their expertise and for all of our attendees for taking the time to be with us today. My understanding is that we don't automatically get kicked out of the webinar right now at 12:30. So if anybody, panelists or attendees, has a few extra minutes and is willing to stick around, I would love for us to have an opportunity to talk through a few of the fantastic questions that have been posed by members of the audience. And just to expeditiously get us started, I'm going to pose a question to Corina, if you don't mind. So following up on this topic of engaging communities, so what are some strategies that we can use to engage communities that have been marginalized in conservation efforts and solutions?
Thank you, Carrie, for that question. I think what's really critical to understand is that when it comes to community engagement with any community of any kind, the relationship building has to be the foundation, especially when you're dealing with a system that has systemically excluded the same demographics of people over and over and over again, both in the creation of the problem and oftentimes in the creation of the solutions. And so being intentional about building relationships with members, stakeholders in those communities in order to understand what their priorities are. What is it that they care about? Because oftentimes we can have the tendency to create programs and initiatives without being informed by what the communities we're trying to serve actually care about and actually need. So making sure that you are both being informed by their lived experiences as well as holding yourself accountable to them. So they're the ones who are telling you, yes, this was a successful initiative, this was a successful program, allowing them to kind of create the metrics by which you are measuring the success of your interactions with engagement with these communities.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Corina, for that additional insight. So there were a couple other questions that we told the attendees we would answer live, and I'm gonna put another one of those out there really quick. If you're still here as an attendee, feel free to add more questions, and our panelists have been really generous about trying to answer those in the Q&A. So there was a question about to what extent we anticipate increased management needs for natural areas of species and habitats shift, and also of whether there are any analyses of regulatory or policy barriers to facilitating habitat corridors. I'm guessing this is a question for John, but if anybody wants to chime in here, that would be great.
Okay. With regard to analyses of regulatory and policy barriers, I'm not aware of any study. There probably are some. I think it's a very broad area, so you can kind of focus on key habitats, which is what we do, but realize that, and I think Jenny pointed out that a lot of the habitats that we have in our landscape have been modified. So our approach and the approach of other conservation organizations is, target the best and then connect with the rest. But that kind of leads into the other part of the problem, which is, how do you get the resources to do the management? Because these properties, once conserved, whether it's fee simple acquisition or conservation easements, they have to be managed appropriately. And that may be more difficult over time. That the ability to do prescribed burning may be more constrained in the future. So we have to keep that in mind. But we have to kind of take the long view and look at a piece of habitat as what it can be in the future.
Thank you so much, John. So just one additional question in the Q&A asking, and this is also following up for Corina, and I'll open this up also to the rest of the panelists. If you know of additional resources for people to get involved, the question for Corina specifically asked about enhancing community access to community or citizen science and local community participation. For example, apps that might better reach underrepresented groups. And I just want to open also the question to thinking about ways that people who are attending can engage with all of the research and projects that are going on that you all have highlighted today. And I know John gave us some great ideas about landscape choices that people could make, but would love to hear everybody chime in on this final question. Go ahead, Corina.
Yeah, so many of you may be aware of some of the more popular applications for collecting data about life around you, right? eBird is one that is very specific to birds, and while it is no more accessible than something like iNaturalist, which is my personal favorite and I think is used across a wider demographic cross-section of the United States, eBird tends to be used by people who are white, older, with money, not because it costs any money to use eBird or anything like that, but because the people who are engaged in that activity are kind of the ones that are most knowledgeable about its existence. However, iNaturalist is an application that I have seen and experienced to be used by a much wider diversity of people, both here in Georgia and just in the cities in which I've lived. And so I would definitely encourage people who are interested, because you don't have to go out and buy field guides to identify plants and bugs and birds. To me, that has been the most accessible digital application for people to kind of engage the world around them.
Carrie, can I real quickly give and Corina, another online site to look for? It's called discoverlife.org. Discover Life was started by a retired University of Georgia professor, John Pickering. And for that, I think it's possible to take a picture, a cell phone or any other kind of photograph of whatever it is you're thinking of and wondering about, and post it. And you might be able to find some good information, including species names, but also ecological information. Discoverlife.org.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jackie and Corina. So I know everybody who's attending and who's a panelist, you have a lot of demands on your time. So we'll go ahead and wrap up, but I would like to make one last plug for anyone who hasn't already to please engage with the Georgia Climate Project through the Georgia Climate Portal. As has been mentioned in the chat and the Q&A, we'll be posting a recording of this webinar and encouraging people to continue reaching out if you are an expert or a leader or just somebody who's interested in these topics, to try to find ways for us to grow these partnerships and grow sort of matching up solutions with some of the challenges that have been highlighted today. So thank you all so much for your time and your attendance. And I don't know if Rachel, you've got any other last reminders for folks?
Just a quick reminder that I missed when that's
Uh-oh.
I think Rachel may be
learn me. It's what Jeff. Oh no.
I think Rachel.
Is my internet a little bit? Let's see if I can. Oh no.
We've got you
can you
back
hear my
now,
voice
Rachel.
now, or is it you got okay, I took my video down, but just wanted to quickly flag that there is an upcoming Georgia Climate Conference that will be hosted at Jekyll Island Convention Center April 28th through 29th next year. This is going to be hosted by the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, and they've opened up a call for posters. So this is a really exciting partnership, sort of bouncing off our last climate conference that the Georgia Climate Project hosted in 2019. So we just wanted to go ahead and flag that. And before we go, I mean, thank you. Can we just I know virtual round of applause to everyone who was able to present, our panelists. Thank you, Carrie, for hosting and moderating this today. This was a fantastic discussion. So thank you again to everyone. And we will continue to be in touch with for everyone who registered today with recordings, resources, links to our website. So stay posted. You'll definitely be hearing from us. Thanks, y'all.